The Hartsfield heat. Agent Eleanor Vance's jaw tightened as she sensed the impending storm. She was a seasoned FBI assistant director, a woman who'd faced down hardened criminals and navigated treacherous political landscapes. But here, in the bustling heart of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the threat came not from a foreign adversary or a domestic terrorist, but from something far more insidious: unchecked bias. One wrong word, one misconstrued gesture, and the carefully constructed facade of order and security could crumble, revealing the raw, ugly truth that still simmered beneath the surface of American society. A smirk, barely perceptible, played on the lips of Officer Mark Olson as he approached her. Eleanor recognized the look. She'd seen it countless times before. It was a cocktail of condescension, arrogance, and a thinly veiled contempt that targeted individuals based on their race, gender, or perceived social standing. It was a look that said, "I'm in charge here, and you're going to play by my rules." Real Life Stories was about to capture a moment when deeply ingrained prejudice collided with unwavering authority. It was a story of what happens when power is abused, when a badge becomes a weapon, and when the quest for justice demands more than just blind obedience. Eleanor Vance entered Hartsfield-Jackson with a singular focus: to reach Washington, D.C., for a crucial FBI conference. The fate of several key initiatives hung in the balance, and her presence was not merely expected, it was essential. In her world, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death, every moment was precious. The terminal throbbed with the frenetic energy of thousands of travelers. Rolling suitcases clicked rhythmically against the polished floors. Hurried announcements echoed through the cavernous space, and the air crackled with the nervous anticipation of journeys begun and reunions awaited. But amidst this symphony of organized chaos, one discordant note shattered the harmony. It was the glare. Officer Mark Olson fixed her with a gaze that could freeze molten steel. He stood ramrod straight, his uniform immaculate, his posture radiating an aura of unshakable self-importance. Eleanor had been profiled before, but never so brazenly. Her confident stride, honed over years of navigating hostile environments, faltered momentarily as Olson's sneering voice sliced through the ambient noise. "Ma'am, is this your bag?" he barked, his tone laced with an acidic disdain that felt deliberately calculated to provoke. In that instant, the air thickened with tension. The question hung in the air. What would you do if your identity was questioned in the most public and humiliating way possible? How would you react when your reputation and authority were challenged by someone whose only power came from a uniform and a badge? Eleanor met his gaze, her expression betraying nothing. Years of training had taught her to control her emotions, to present a calm and collected demeanor even in the face of extreme provocation. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice measured and even, despite the simmering anger that threatened to boil over. She had faced injustice before, in many forms, but today injustice wore a uniform and carried a firearm. The stakes were higher than ever. Olson's eyes, like those of a predator sizing up its prey, flickered over her state-issued driver's license. His suspicion, fueled by something far more primal than legitimate concern, deepened with each passing second. "Where are you headed?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly, drawing the attention of nearby travelers. "Washington, D.C., Eleanor responded, keeping her answer short and devoid of any unnecessary details. "Work." She offered no further explanation, no elaboration. She had already presented her government-issued identification at the initial security checkpoint. It should have been enough. It was enough for everyone else. Yet his eyes continued to probe, searching for something that wasn't there, something that would justify his prejudice. Before she could anticipate his next move, Olson stepped aside, gesturing towards a cramped metal desk tucked away in a dimly lit corner. The secondary screening area, a place of isolation and scrutiny, a stark contrast to the bustling activity of the main terminal. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, a primal response to the perceived threat. She followed him, each step heavy with the weight of potential humiliation. She knew what this was. It was a power play, a deliberate attempt to assert dominance and undermine her authority. At the desk, Olson's voice hardened, the veneer of professional courtesy vanishing completely. "I need to ask you a few questions about your travel plans." His tone was not inquisitive. It was accusatory. It was dismissive, disregarding the order in which the day should unfold, shattering the unspoken agreement of mutual respect that governed civilized society. Eleanor maintained her composure. Her eyes locked on his. "I have official meetings at the J. Edgar Hoover building," she stated, her tone leaving no room for ambiguity. "My presence is required." Olson's jaw clenched, his face contorting into a mask of barely suppressed anger. "Your FBI credentials don't look standard." He snatched her FBI credential case, flipping it open with a force that belied its official importance. He held it up to the light, scrutinizing it as if it were a counterfeit. His hand lingered for a moment, as if contemplating whether to outright reject it. Then, with a visible effort, he placed the credential back on the desk, treating it as if it were contaminated. Can you believe an officer would question a verified FBI agent? A question rippled through the minds of the gathering onlookers. Eleanor's carefully constructed calm cracked, just for a fraction of a second. But she recovered quickly, drawing upon years of experience in high-pressure situations. "That is a standard FBI credential," she said, her words crisp and precise, carrying the weight of her position and the undeniable force of truth. "You can verify it with the Bureau." Yet instead of bringing the situation to a swift and logical conclusion, her words seemed to fuel Olson's disdain. It was as if he resented being proven wrong, as if his prejudice was so deeply ingrained that it blinded him to reason. With a dismissive grunt, he turned and stalked toward a nearby secure office, disappearing behind a reinforced door. Inside the sterile back office, the phone rang with an insistent shrillness. Olson snatched it up, his voice laced with a skepticism that bordered on outright hostility. "This is Officer Mark Olson," he barked into the receiver. "I need to verify the credentials of this FBI agent." His words were curt, lacking any trace of the deference that should be afforded to a federal law enforcement officer. The hesitation before the word agent did not go unnoticed. On the other end of the line, a disembodied voice calmly confirmed Eleanor's identity, her rank, and her reason for travel. The truth, stark and irrefutable, clashed with Olson's preconceived notions, creating a palpable tension that filled the room. His posture stiffened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone. He refused to relinquish his perceived control. He had gone too far back down now. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat alone at the metal desk, her eyes fixed on the ticking clock on the wall. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, a delay that jeopardized her mission and allowed Olson's prejudice to fester. The onlookers, a diverse group of travelers from all walks of life, shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this was far from standard procedure. It was a blatant display of power, a deliberate attempt to intimidate and humiliate. Sergeant Rollins, a seasoned officer who had been observing the situation with growing unease, stepped in, his presence offering a small measure of reassurance. His voice was low, almost apologetic, a stark contrast to Olson's aggressive demeanor. "Miss Vance, please bear with us," he said, his words a soft counterpoint to Olson's rigid authority. "We're just following protocol." Time crawled by, each agonizing second amplifying Eleanor's frustration. Her mind raced, replaying past incidents of racial profiling, the countless times she had been subjected to unjust scrutiny simply because of her race and gender. But today was different. Today, she was not merely a victim. She was the force that would turn the tide, the catalyst for change that would expose the systemic biases that plagued the institution she served. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity. Finally, the call ended. The FBI operator had unequivocally confirmed Eleanor's credentials, leaving no room for doubt. Olson emerged from the office, his face a carefully constructed mask of forced neutrality. But behind the mask, Eleanor could see the flicker of resentment, the lingering bitterness of a man who had been proven wrong but refused to admit it. "We verified your status," he said, his tone devoid of any genuine apology. The words felt hollow, insufficient to quell the storm that had already erupted. Despite the verification, he ordered one final round of questioning, dragging out the encounter. "I need to ask a few more questions about your travel," he insisted, his voice now mechanical, as if he were reciting lines from a script rather than enforcing legitimate protocol. Eleanor's patience, stretched to its breaking point, finally snapped. "I've given you all the details," she said, her voice steady but edged with steel. "I'm late for a federal conference of critical importance to this country." Around them, the crowd murmured in disapproval. Several onlookers, emboldened by Eleanor's unwavering composure, began to voice their concerns. A helpful traveler named Carla, accompanied by Greg Mills, a Delta Airlines gate agent, stepped forward, offering their support. Mills showed Eleanor her boarding pass. "Your flight is about to close," he reminded her, his voice laced with urgency. "Gate B23 is the next terminal over. You'll have to run." The pressure was mounting, both on Eleanor and on Olson. His eyes darted around, revealing a mixture of frustration and an unwillingness to concede defeat. With a curt nod to his partner, Sergeant Rollins, he reluctantly released her. "Fina, you're clear to go, Miss Vance," he snapped, his words dripping with resentment. Eleanor retrieved her belongings, her movements deliberate and controlled. She did not offer a backward glance, but her eyes burned with a silent promise. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The incident, however brief, had already set in motion a chain of events that would reverberate through the halls of power and shake the very foundations of airport security at Hartsfield-Jackson. Back in Atlanta, the FBI swiftly filed a formal complaint, documenting the details of the encounter with meticulous precision. The document was scathing in its assessment: unprofessional behavior, unwarranted delays, and the unmistakable stench of racial bias. It was not merely a personal slight. It was a blatant abuse of power, a violation of the public trust. Within days, the complaint landed on the desk of the airport's chief operating officer, triggering a series of urgent meetings and internal investigations. Internal Affairs launched a full-scale inquiry, pulling security footage, gathering witness testimonies, and compiling records of past incidents involving Officer Mark Olson. A disturbing pattern began to emerge. Olson had repeatedly targeted minority travelers, subjecting them to unwarranted scrutiny and harassment. His actions were not isolated incidents. They were the visible manifestation of a systemic problem that had festered for far too long. The investigation moved with unprecedented speed. An internal review panel was convened, comprised of senior airport officials, representatives from the local NAACP chapter, and independent legal experts. The room was charged with tension as the panel meticulously presented the evidence. Witness statements were read aloud. Security footage was analyzed frame by frame, painting a clear and undeniable picture. Eleanor Vance, calm and resolute, versus an officer whose unchecked prejudice had driven him to escalate the situation unnecessarily. The data was irrefutable. Olson's history of targeting minority passengers was laid bare for all to see, exposing the deep-seated biases that had guided his actions. Before the panel could render its final decision, a pivotal moment arrived. A voice in the room, filled with a righteous anger, asked a question that resonated with everyone present. What would you do if you were faced with relentless prejudice from someone in power? The question hung in the air, a challenge to the conscience of everyone present, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable reality of systemic bias and the moral obligation to stand up against injustice. The climax was swift and decisive. The panel announced its verdict. Officer Mark Olson was to be terminated immediately for egregious misconduct. The decision was based on overwhelming evidence of racial bias, abuse of power, and a blatant disregard for the rights of travelers. Olson's union representatives protested vehemently, arguing that he was being unfairly targeted, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. The evidence was simply too damning. Olson was escorted out of the building, his badge confiscated, his career in ruins. The image of a disgraced officer, his face etched with bitterness and disbelief, served as a stark warning to others who might be tempted to abuse their authority. But the fallout did not end there. The district attorney launched an external investigation into potential civil rights violations, examining whether Olson's actions constituted a criminal offense. As the wheels of justice turned, Olson's personal life began to unravel. Background checks revealed a pattern of troubling behavior, a history of complaints and disciplinary actions that had been swept under the rug. Friends, colleagues, and even those who had once admired his toughness began to distance themselves from him, fearful of being tainted by his disgrace. He was left isolated, his future bleak. In the aftermath of the scandal, Hartsfield-Jackson implemented sweeping changes to its security protocols. New guidelines were introduced, emphasizing the importance of respect, dignity, and unbiased treatment of all travelers. Officers underwent rigorous training in bias recognition and de-escalation techniques, learning how to identify and challenge their own prejudices. Supervisors were mandated to justify every secondary screening, providing a clear and transparent rationale for their actions. A civilian oversight committee was established to monitor patterns of racial profiling, ensuring that the new guidelines were being effectively enforced. The committee was empowered to investigate complaints, review security footage, and make recommendations for further improvements. The transformation was not instantaneous, and there were still pockets of resistance within the ranks of the airport security force. But the message was clear: abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. Eleanor Vance, despite the ordeal she had endured, found her resolve strengthened. She channeled her anger and frustration into action, becoming a vocal advocate for civil rights and police reform. She began speaking at panels and leadership forums, recounting the events at the airport with unflinching honesty, her words resonating deeply with those who had faced similar battles. Silence has its own blowback, she told an audience of aspiring law enforcement officers. We must speak up, even when it's uncomfortable, or we allow injustice to fester. If you were in my shoes, would you accept injustice, or would you fight back? Her testimony reached the highest levels of government. At FBI headquarters, her superiors commended her courage and promised to pursue the matter with unwavering determination. Eleanor's complaint was not just a personal grievance. It was a catalyst for systemic change. In boardrooms and behind closed doors, discussions were ignited about reforming practices and rooting out prejudice in the corridors of power. The repercussions of that fateful day at Hartsfield-Jackson were felt far and wide. Policies were rewritten, training programs were overhauled, and the case became a touchstone for civil rights advocacy in transportation security. Every time a secondary screening was conducted, the memory of Eleanor Vance's confrontation served as a reminder that respect and dignity were non-negotiable. Near the resolution of the investigation, as the airport community absorbed the magnitude of the transformation, one final question lingered in the air. What price are we willing to pay for justice in a system steeped in bias? It was a question that demanded reflection, a call to action for institutions and individuals alike. It was a question that would continue to shape the ongoing struggle for equality and justice in America. Eleanor Vance's story was far from over. Even as she boarded her flight to D.C., her mind was already crafting plans for the next steps in her campaign. Her experience had ignited a movement, a shift in how power was monitored and held accountable. The confrontation at the check-in was not just an isolated incident. It was the spark that lit a fire for systemic change. Every word she spoke, every testimony she gave, carried the weight of countless others who had been silenced by discrimination. And while Officer Mark Olson's fall served as a grim reminder of what happens when prejudice goes unchecked, Eleanor Vance's unwavering resolve illuminated the path toward a more just future. In the end, Justice had prevailed, not with the roar of a crowd or the clamor of a protest, but with the quiet, relentless pursuit of truth. The legacy of that fateful day at Hartsfield-Jackson was etched into policy, into practice, and most importantly, into the hearts of those who believed that no badge was above accountability. The change was palpable, and the message was clear. In a system where power meets prejudice, courage is the only weapon that can truly make a difference. Eleanor stepped away, her silhouette framed by the fading terminal lights. Whispers of disbelief followed her, a testament to the impact she had made. The confrontation had reshaped more than a single moment. It had ignited change. Her quiet resolve, now tempered by raw injustice, spoke louder than any reprimand. In the aftermath, a discarded badge lay crumpled on the floor, a stark symbol of power undone. Has true justice been served? Or is this only the spark that will ignite a revolution? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The truth must be exposed, and the fight for equality must continue. Eleanor turned and walked towards her gate, leaving behind a trail of questions and a renewed sense of hope. The future was uncertain, but she was ready to face it, armed with the knowledge that one person standing up for what is right can change the world. She boarded her flight, taking her seat near the window. As the plane soared into the sky, leaving the lights of Atlanta behind, she looked down and smiled. The fight had just begun. Beyond the badge, the ripple effect, the immediate aftermath of the Hartsfield-Jackson incident was a whirlwind. Eleanor found herself juggling her demanding FBI responsibilities with a barrage of media requests, speaking engagements, and meetings with civil rights organizations. She was determined to leverage her experience to create lasting change, but the sheer volume of demands threatened to overwhelm her. One of the first things she did was to connect with other victims of racial profiling in airports. She discovered a network of individuals and advocacy groups who had been fighting this battle for years, often with little recognition or support. She lent her voice and her platform to their cause, amplifying their stories and demanding accountability from the Transportation Security Administration. She also worked closely with the airport's Civilian Oversight Committee, providing her insights and recommendations for improving training programs and implementing more effective oversight mechanisms. She stressed the importance of data-driven analysis, arguing that the only way to truly address racial profiling was to track and analyze the demographic data of those subjected to secondary screenings. Her efforts were met with resistance from some quarters. Some airport officials and law enforcement officers felt that she was being unfairly critical, that she was painting the entire system with the same broad brush. They argued that they were simply trying to do their jobs, to protect the safety of the traveling public, and that they were being unfairly demonized. Eleanor understood their concerns, but she refused to back down. She argued that true security could not be achieved at the expense of civil rights, that a system that routinely subjected innocent people to unwarranted scrutiny was not only unjust, but also ultimately ineffective. We can't afford to let fear cloud our judgment, she said at one public forum. We can't afford to sacrifice our values in the name of security. True security comes from building trust, from treating everyone with dignity and respect, from ensuring that everyone feels safe and welcome in our airports. Her words resonated with many, but they also provoked a backlash. She received hate mail, death threats, and online harassment. Some conservative commentators accused her of being a race baiter, of trying to undermine law enforcement. Eleanor refused to be intimidated. She knew that she was on the right side of history, and she was determined to fight for what she believed in, no matter the personal cost. Meanwhile, the investigation into Officer Mark Olson's conduct continued to unfold. The district attorney's office convened a grand jury to consider whether to bring criminal charges against him. The grand jury heard testimony from Eleanor, from Sergeant Rollins, from several other travelers who had witnessed Olson's behavior. They also reviewed Olson's personnel file, which revealed a disturbing pattern of complaints and disciplinary actions. After several weeks of deliberation, the grand jury returned an indictment, charging Olson with multiple counts of civil rights violations. He was arrested and released on bail, pending trial. The trial was a media circus. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, demonstrating Olson's history of targeting minority travelers. The defense argued that Olson was simply doing his job, that he had no racial animus, and that he was being unfairly scapegoated. They called several character witnesses who testified that Olson was a good man, a dedicated officer, and that he would never intentionally discriminate against anyone, undermines law enforcement, and perpetuates injustice. "This is not just about what happened to me," she said on the stand. "It's about what happens to countless other people every day in this country. It's about the systemic biases that are deeply embedded in our institutions, that perpetuate inequality and injustice." Her testimony was powerful and moving. It swayed some members of the jury, but others remained skeptical. After several days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. They found Olson guilty on some counts, but not guilty on others. He was convicted of violating Eleanor's civil rights, but he was acquitted of the more serious charges of racial profiling. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some civil rights activists expressed outrage, arguing that Olson had gotten off too lightly. Others praised the jury for holding him accountable. But she was determined to keep fighting, to keep pushing for change, until the system was truly fair for everyone. Olson was sentenced to probation and ordered to undergo sensitivity training. He was also barred from working in law enforcement again. His career was over, his reputation was ruined, and his future was uncertain. He became a symbol of the consequences of prejudice and abuse of power. In the aftermath of the trial, Hartsfield-Jackson Airport continued to implement reforms. They hired a diversity consultant to review their policies and procedures. They created a community advisory board to provide input on security issues. They launched a public awareness campaign to promote tolerance and respect. The airport also worked to improve its data collection and analysis capabilities. They began tracking the demographic data of those subjected to secondary screenings, and they used this data to identify potential patterns of racial profiling. The results were encouraging. The number of complaints of racial profiling decreased significantly. The level of trust between the airport security force and the traveling public increased. Hartsfield-Jackson became a model for other airports around the country. They shared their best practices and their lessons learned with other transportation hubs, helping to promote more equitable and effective security measures. Eleanor Vance continued to work for the FBI, but she also became a prominent advocate for civil rights and police reform, increase transparency in law enforcement, and promote greater accountability for police misconduct. She also worked to build bridges between law enforcement and the communities they serve. She organized community dialogues, facilitated training sessions, and encouraged police officers to engage with the people they were sworn to protect. Her efforts were not always successful. She faced resistance from some quarters, and she experienced setbacks along the way. But she never lost her passion, her determination, or her hope for a better future. Years later, Eleanor Vance reflected on her experience at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. She realized that it had been a turning point in her life, a moment that had transformed her from a career law enforcement officer into a champion for justice. She understood that the fight against prejudice and discrimination was never truly over, that it required constant vigilance, constant effort, and constant commitment. But she also believed that progress was possible, that change was achievable, and that a more just and equitable society was within reach. As she looked back on her journey, she was filled with gratitude for the people who had supported her, for the allies who had stood by her side, and for the countless individuals who had dedicated their lives to the cause of justice. She knew that she was not alone, that she was part of a larger movement, a movement that spanned generations and crossed borders, a movement that was committed to building a better world for all. And she knew that, as long as there were people willing to stand up against injustice, to speak out against prejudice, and to fight for what is right, there was always hope. Eleanor Vance, the FBI assistant director who had been unfairly targeted at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, had become a symbol of courage, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Her story was a reminder that one person standing up for what is right can change the world. The years passed. Eleanor eventually retired from the FBI, but her commitment to social justice remained as strong as ever. She founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting civil rights and police reform. The organization worked to educate the public about the dangers of racial profiling, to advocate for legislation that would strengthen protections against discrimination, and to support community-based initiatives that promote positive relationships between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Eleanor traveled the country, speaking at conferences, leading workshops, and mentoring young activists. She became a mentor and an inspiration to a new generation of leaders. One of her most successful initiatives was a program that paired young people from marginalized communities with law enforcement officers. The program provided opportunities for the participants to get to know each other, to build trust, and to break down stereotypes. The program was highly effective. Participants reported that they had gained a better understanding of each other's perspectives, that they had developed more positive attitudes toward law enforcement, and that they were more likely to report crimes and cooperate with the police. Eleanor also worked to promote greater diversity within law enforcement. She argued that police departments should reflect the communities they serve, and she encouraged young people from diverse backgrounds to consider careers in law enforcement. She partnered with local police departments to recruit and train officers from underrepresented communities. She also advocated for policies that would make police departments more inclusive and welcoming to officers from diverse backgrounds. Her efforts paid off. The number of officers from underrepresented communities increased significantly. The relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served improved. Eleanor Vance's legacy was secure. She had made a profound and lasting impact on the fight for social justice. She had inspired countless people to stand up against injustice, to speak out against prejudice, and to fight for what is right. Her story was a reminder that one person standing up for what is right can change the world. One day, Eleanor received a letter from a young woman who had been inspired by her story. The young woman had been subjected to racial profiling at an airport, and she had been devastated by the experience. But after reading about Eleanor's story, she had found the courage to speak out, to file a complaint, and to demand accountability. She had even decided to pursue a career in law enforcement, hoping to make a difference from within the system. Eleanor was deeply moved by the letter. She knew that her experience at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport had not been in vain, that it had inspired others to fight for justice. She wrote a letter back to the young woman, encouraging her to pursue her dreams and to never give up on the fight for a better world. Eleanor Vance's journey had come full circle. She had started as a victim of injustice, but she had transformed herself into a champion for justice. Her story was a testament to the power of courage, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. It was a reminder that one person standing up for what is right can change the world. And as long as there were people like Eleanor Vance, the fight for social justice would continue. The world would slowly be changed for the better, a better place for all. The next section is around 30,000 words. Mark Olson's Descent, a study in unchecked prejudice. While Eleanor Vance dedicated her life to rectifying the injustices she faced, Mark Olson's life took a drastically different turn. His fall from grace was steep and unforgiving, a descent into bitterness and isolation that served as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of unchecked prejudice. After his conviction, Olson became a pariah. His friends and former colleagues distanced themselves, afraid of being associated with his disgrace. His wife, unable to cope with the shame and the financial strain, filed for divorce. He lost his house, his savings, and his sense of purpose. Unable to find work in law enforcement or any related field, Olson struggled to make ends meet. He bounced from one low-paying job to another, working as a security guard, a warehouse worker, and even a janitor. Each job was a constant reminder of his former status, of the power and authority he had once wielded. His anger and resentment grew with each passing day. He blamed Eleanor Vance for his downfall, convinced that she had unfairly targeted him and destroyed his life. He saw himself as a victim, a scapegoat for a system that was obsessed with political correctness. He spent hours online, consuming right-wing media and conspiracy theories that reinforced his sense of grievance. He joined online forums where he found like-minded individuals who shared his anger and his prejudices. These forums became his sanctuary, a place where he could vent his frustrations and find validation for his beliefs. He became increasingly radicalized, convinced that he was fighting a battle against the forces of darkness that were threatening to destroy America. He began to stockpile weapons and ammunition, convinced that a civil war was imminent. He fantasized about taking revenge on Eleanor Vance and the other people he blamed for his downfall. One day, Olson decided to attend a rally organized by a far-right extremist group. He traveled to a remote location, armed with a handgun and several high-capacity magazines. At the rally, he listened to speeches filled with hate and vitriol. He felt a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose that he had not felt since he lost his job. As the rally reached its climax, a speaker began to incite the crowd, urging them to take action against their enemies. Olson felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal urge to lash out. He pulled out his handgun and fired several shots into the air. The crowd erupted in chaos, screaming and running for cover. Olson was quickly apprehended by law enforcement officers. He was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including inciting a riot and possessing illegal firearms. This time, there was no sympathy, no leniency. Olson was convicted and sentenced to a long prison term. In prison, Olson became even more isolated and embittered. He refused to participate in any rehabilitation programs, convinced that he had done nothing wrong. He spent his days reading extremist literature and plotting his revenge. He wrote letters to his online allies, urging them to continue the fight. One day, Olson received a visit from a journalist who was writing a book about the rise of right-wing extremism. The journalist wanted to interview Olson to understand what had led him down this path. Olson initially refused to cooperate, but eventually he agreed to talk. He told the journalist his story, painting himself as a victim of injustice. He blamed Eleanor Vance, the media, the liberals, and the system for his downfall. He refused to take responsibility for his own actions. The journalist listened patiently, but she also challenged Olson's narrative. She pointed out his history of prejudice, his abuse of power, and his violent tendencies. Olson became enraged. He accused the journalist of being biased and unfair. He terminated the interview. The journalist left the prison, shaken by her encounter with Olson. She realized that he was beyond redemption, that he had become consumed by his own hatred and resentment. The book was published and became a bestseller. It told Olson's story in detail, exposing his prejudices, his delusions, and his descent into extremism. The book served as a warning about the dangers of unchecked prejudice, the seductive power of hate, and the importance of holding individuals accountable for their actions. In prison, Olson read the book and became even more enraged. He realized that he had become a symbol of everything he hated. He vowed to clear his name, to expose the truth, and to take revenge on those who had wronged him. But he knew that he was trapped, that he was powerless to change his fate. Mark Olson died in prison, a broken and embittered man. He had destroyed his own life and the lives of those around him. His story served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that prejudice is a destructive force that can consume individuals and tear apart societies. It served as a reminder that unchecked power can lead to abuse, corruption, and ultimately, to ruin. And it served as a reminder that the fight against prejudice is a never-ending battle, a battle that requires constant vigilance, constant effort, and constant commitment. The life of Mark Olson was a stark contrast to that of Eleanor Vance. While Eleanor channeled her experience into positive change, Mark allowed his prejudice and anger to consume him. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the consequences of unchecked bias and the importance of personal responsibility. It shows how resentment can fester, leading to radicalization and ultimately destruction. His story underscores the need for empathy, understanding, and a willingness to confront our own prejudices, lest we follow a similar path. The final section is around 30,000 words. The lingering scars. A community divided and the path to healing. The events at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport and the subsequent trials of Mark Olson had a profound and lasting impact on the Atlanta community. The incident exposed deep-seated racial tensions and reignited long-simmering resentments. The community was divided, trust was eroded, and the path to healing seemed long and arduous. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, protests erupted throughout the city. Demonstrators demanded justice for Eleanor Vance and called for an end to racial profiling. They marched on the airport, on the police station, and on the courthouse, chanting slogans and carrying signs that condemned prejudice and abuse of power. The protests were largely peaceful, but there were some instances of violence. Some demonstrators clashed with police officers, throwing rocks and bottles. Some businesses were vandalized and looted. The city was on edge, teetering on the brink of chaos. The mayor declared a state of emergency and imposed a curfew. He called for calm and urged the community to come together to address the underlying issues that had fueled the unrest. The local NAACP chapter organized a series of community meetings, bringing together residents, law enforcement officers, and elected officials. The meetings were tense and emotional, but they provided a forum for people to express their grievances, to share their experiences, and to begin to rebuild trust. During one of the meetings, a young black man stood up and spoke passionately about his own experiences with racial profiling. He described how he had been stopped and harassed by police officers on numerous occasions, simply because of the color of his skin. He said that he was tired of being treated like a criminal, that he was tired of living in fear, and that he was tired of being discriminated against. He demanded that the police department take action to address racial profiling and to treat all residents with respect and dignity. His words resonated with many people in the room. Some white residents expressed shock and dismay, realizing for the first time the extent of the problem. Some black residents nodded in agreement, sharing their own stories of mistreatment. The police chief listened attentively, taking notes and promising to take action. He said that he was committed to addressing racial profiling and to building a more trusting relationship with the community. In the weeks and months that followed, the police department implemented several reforms. They revised their training curriculum to include more instruction on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. They implemented a body camera program to increase transparency and accountability. They created a community policing unit to foster positive relationships with residents. The city also launched a series of initiatives to address the underlying causes of racial inequality. They invested in job training programs, affordable housing, and educational opportunities. They created a commission to study the history of racism in Atlanta and to develop recommendations for addressing its legacy. These efforts were met with mixed results. Some residents welcomed the reforms, while others remained skeptical. Some felt that the changes were too little, too late. Others felt that the city was overreacting, that it was pandering to the demands of a vocal minority. The divisions within the community remained deep, but there were also signs of progress. The number of complaints of racial profiling decreased. The level of trust between the police department and the community improved. The city began to heal. One of the most significant developments was the establishment of a youth leadership council. The council brought together young people from diverse backgrounds to address the issues facing their community. The council members organized community service projects, led workshops on diversity and inclusion, and advocated for policies that would benefit young people. One of the council's first initiatives was to organize a series of dialogues between students and police officers. The dialogues provided a safe space for young people to ask questions, to share their concerns, and to get to know the officers who were patrolling their neighborhoods. The dialogues were transformative. The students gained a better understanding of the challenges that police officers face, and the officers gained a better understanding of the concerns of young people. The dialogues led to a more positive relationship between students and police officers, and it helped to build trust within the community. The Youth Leadership Council also organized a community-wide celebration of diversity. The celebration featured music, food, and cultural performances from around the world. The event was a huge success, bringing together people from all walks of life to celebrate their shared humanity. The community-wide celebration became an annual event, a symbol of Atlanta's commitment to diversity and inclusion. The event was a reminder that the city's strength lay in its diversity, that its future depended on its ability to embrace and celebrate its differences. Years later, Atlanta was a different city. It was still struggling with the legacy of racism, but it was also a city that was committed to building a more just and equitable society. It was a city that had learned from its mistakes, that had embraced its diversity, and that had emerged stronger and more resilient than ever before. The scars of the Hartsfield-Jackson incident remained, but they were fading. The community was healing, trust was being rebuilt, and the path to a brighter future was becoming clearer. The story of Atlanta was a story of hope, a story of resilience, and a story of the enduring power of the human spirit. It was a story that showed that even in the face of great adversity, communities can come together to overcome their differences, to heal their wounds, and to build a better world for all. And the story of Eleanor Vance and Mark Olson served as a constant reminder of the importance of fighting for justice, of standing up against prejudice, and of building a society where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. The legacy of their actions would forever be etched in the city's history, a powerful lesson for generations to come.